you guys for what you've been able to do in planting Hillsong here in New York.
What's New York, I guess, now? What have been the biggest changes you've seen from when you started to what this city looks like and even what churches have done? Give us a quick glimpse before I get into some of this, topic we're going to cover a little bit. What's it been like? What have you seen changes in people and the flow of the city?
Wow. I've been in New York most of my life. Came here in 1957. Grew up in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Bushwick, Brooklyn. And right here.
We got some people from Brooklyn in the house. Okay, thank you. That's a real
Brooklyn's
Brooklyn
in the
shout
house. And grew up in 60s and early 70s at a time that was very tumultuous. The 1960s was a decade of all types of revolutions going on in the United States. Social, political revolution, civil rights movement, religious, music, you name it. There were revolutions for everyone. And I was actively involved in that. I was part of the desegregation program. We were bused from Bed-Stuy and Bushwick, Brooklyn, out to white schools in Queens to desegregate those schools. So that's where I went to school, and I was part of that whole experiment there. And was very socially conscious at an early age, growing up without a father. It really brought me to a place of connecting the dots in the streets where I grew up. But I became very early a social activist and involved with certain social movements that were taking place here in the nation.
Amazing. Let me ask you this. So our culture right now, I think that if anybody turns on the TV or just living, in our world today, we've got some problems. We've got racial problems. We've got conversations that people don't want to have. In New York City, sometimes we are hit with stuff that's front page, but our whole country right now is, if we were going to describe it, I think everybody would agree that there's a frustration. There's a sense of unrest. There is some topics where people are trying to make it black and white, and I think it's much deeper than black and white. I think racism is a sin issue. And I think one of the biggest problems is there's no conversations, happening. And so what I wanted to ask you today was, what do you think some of the factors are that have led our culture to be where it is today in this state where it seems more polarized than ever? Or maybe it's just getting more press than ever, because I know people have been getting on the wrong side of that conversation forever. But what do you think about that? How have we gotten here?
I think something you just said is important. It's getting more press. I grew up in racial realities. I was chased out of white neighborhoods. My father was white, my mother black. So I grew up as an interracial child, but never knowing my father and having to kind of choose where my identity was going to be. But America continues to be in an identity crisis. When you have those in power saying, okay, we need to let the Syrian refugees in because this is who we are as America. And you have another group saying, we need to keep them out because this is who we are as America. It begs the question, who are we? So we are in that crisis of identity, self-concept, meaning, sense of purpose. And we're dealing with issues that have not been resolved because they haven't been faced by America as a nation. There's a powerful passage in Proverbs 13:12. It says, hope deferred makes the heart sick. So when you see shootings, which I don't agree with, whether it's in Dallas, shooting police officers, whether it's police officers assaulting citizens like in Baton Rouge, like in Minnesota, and the list goes on. These are symptoms of a hope that especially people of color have carried for a long time in this country. Interesting, the passage there, hope deferred makes the heart sick. The word sick there is really expressed in the Hebrew language as a woman trying to give birth. She's in travail. the contractions are very close together, and she's trying to have this baby, but the baby just won't come out. So it really expresses deeply where we are in American society. So when you see someone like Micah Johnson, who was the one who perpetrated that shooting against the police officers, which again, I disagree with violence being the answer, but it came from a very deep and profound place of spiritual, moral, ethical frustration within him in trying to make sense of what's going on in the world around him.
You say really profound things like it's normal, and it's totally not. You would have police officers in your church, and you would also have people who are frustrated with what they would sometimes call the establishment, or basically both people on the sides of the protest line. And you've done it well for so long. I know there's a lot of church leaders in here, or Christians that love their church, but might even find themselves maybe in the same aisle with somebody who believes something polar opposite. How can we engage this moment and somehow keep unity? How have you done it for so long? And what ideas can we steal right now to be able to at least let people know we might not understand each other right now, and there might be some tension, and we might even stand on a different political side. But how do we navigate it as leaders? How as a Christian, can you say that you're my brother and disagree so heavily on certain matters? And how do we move forward with it? That's 17 questions in one, I know, but...
Well, look, diversity is strength. The way God designed a universe, every ecosystem needs diversity in order to thrive and progress. Remove that diversity, and that ecosystem begins to break down. So what is true in every world, every kingdom, it is especially true amongst human beings. Diversity is our strength. It's not our adversary. It's not a negative. But we have to work beyond the fears of not knowing each other and engage in conversations like this that are more public, because unfortunately too many of these conversations take place privately, you see, and people are afraid to say what they are really thinking and feeling, whether it comes out of ignorance or knowledge. They're afraid to say it because of the backlash that might come. So the elephant continues to sit in the room, and nobody wants to talk about it. But, there are people like me who love to talk about it and put it out there. Look, I got saved. A guy named Nicky Cruz brought me to the Lord. He's a guy, he's a former head of the Mau Mau gangs, and I was invited to a meeting where he was sharing his story. At that time, I had been 5 years in the Nation of Islam as a black Muslim. So converting from such a radical organization under not Louis Farrakhan, but Elijah Muhammad, going into Christianity, there were a lot of issues that had to be resolved for me. Because remember, for me, from that perspective, especially in the context of black identity, Christianity was the religion of the oppressor. So how can the religion of imperialism and colonization, become my religion, and this Jesus become my Savior? So God had to deal with me supernaturally. So that night after Nicky was, sharing his story, I could hardly understand. His English, his Spanglish is what he spoke in. Right. Yeah. So, but he said something about Janis Joplin, drugs, something like that. But he said, "Do you want to receive Jesus?" And man, I had that moment. This was my epiphany. I heard two things. Number one, I'm the God that you're looking for. I intuitively knew that it was Jesus, right? Because I had been searching, regardless of the fact that I was in the Nation. When I got into martial arts, that led me into Eastern philosophies.
Martial arts on top of everything else?
So it led me into Eastern philosophies.
Amazing.
And it led me into Eastern philosophy. So I was still searching, even though I was in a context that really had to do with identification, order, strength, discipline, all those things that the Nation provided, especially for me as a young man growing up in this culture without a father. But I knew somehow intuitively that God, reality, and truth were synonymous. So if I truly found one, the other two would be present. I didn't find the other two in the nation of Islam. So that night, I heard, I'm the God that you're looking for. I knew it was Jesus. But second thing that I heard, which was most important, I and my word are one. See, that was important because the Jesus I knew or the Jesus in the picture, in the movies, you know, long hair, blue-eyed guy, white guy.
The Swiss Jesus.
Yeah. You know, so how do I relate to this Jesus? Until I realized, you know, that if you travel to India, he looks Indian. If you travel to Africa, if you travel downtown Brooklyn, Fulton Street, he's got a white afro. You know, it depends on where you go, the image of Jesus that you'd find. So the Word, he and the Word becoming one, changed everything for me. So now Jesus became the Scripture, and the Word of God came alive, and I fell in love. And it's not the institution of Christianity that saved me, it's the person of Christ. And there's a difference.
That's amazing. I think one of the frustrations, I think, is trying to get people who are maybe in the majority, we could just use white people right now to make it broad, to understand what you just said. Because there's some people who have never thought, like, you know, I have a lot of friends that are of different races, and they'll say things like, you know, that's a white man's God. Or that, like what you just said, that's a religion of the oppressor. Do you believe that we have a genuine systematic racism issue in America?
Oh, absolutely. I understand. Let's take it above racism, because essentially racism is a tool of the power elite to reinforce classism.
Say that again. For those of us that are ADD, get your Twitter ready. Pretend you said it. Be the smartest person at lunch.
Okay. Racism is a tool used by the power elite to reinforce classism. And it's really classism that divides us. You understand? It's about who's got wealth, who's got power. So Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, left, right, doesn't matter. Because whatever the cause that they take up to get into power, once they're in power, it's about maintaining that power, preserving that power, and maintaining the status quo. So we need interim revolutions, interim movements in order to shake up that status quo and hold them beyond civility and order to deal with issues of justice and equity, which is exactly what Jesus spoke to the status quo when he said, you pay tithes, you do all of the religious things, but you failed in the area of mercy, justice, and equity.
Let me ask you this. I think sometimes trying to get people to understand you can be passionate about two different issues at the same time. For instance, you can be passionate against injustice and still love our police force. For some people, their mind is blown at this thought. Yeah. And a lot of people who have never felt that struggle, for instance, would right now, Black Lives Matter, it's a big slogan, it's a big movement, and you'll hear typically white people say, well, all lives matter, and they can't fathom why that could frustrate people. And immediately you want to sit with each person and say, we get that all lives matter, but white people right now are not in danger every time they get pulled over. Saying something like that, and we have police officers here that are amazing, and you know, I would even say the majority of police officers I've ever known are honorable, amazing men and women who lay down their lives. But that doesn't absolve us of the conversation to be able to say it's okay to be able to take a moment. And this is when the word empathy comes in, which I'd like to ask you about. But for me to sit down with maybe a brother of mine who's African American and say, I get it right now. We're not going to go to All Lives Matter. That's the equivalent to, you know, walking up to a breast cancer marathon saying, hey, y'all know diabetes is a problem too. And people are like, we're not marching for diabetes right now.
Not this week, yeah.
I wonder... I wonder if there's a place we can get to as Christians where we're slower to give our point of view and quicker to hear the pain of somebody else. Because I think that's the model
Yeah, you're
But
quoting out of the book of James. Be slow to speak, swift to hear. And until you sit down and hear someone else's story, you're not even qualified to give judgment on their situation, their condition.
Maybe if you could, empathy to me is a big deal right now because it just means, you know, if you look at the news and you see a tragedy and the first thing you do is think of who you want to tell your view to, I think that is a symptom of a society that is then rot, literally. Because if I turn on the TV right now and I see something, the last thing I'm doing is wondering who's at fault. You know, I think the Bible says to party with those who party, mourn with those who mourn. That's a New York City remix edition.
Party with those who party, okay.
And I think right now we are missing some opportunities as the church to be able to go alongside people and say, we can talk about politics down the road. We can talk about what you think might be the issue right now, but there's tears right now. So I'm going to help you dry them, and I'm going to hold you. I'm going to be with you. And I think, what can you tell? Let's just go. We'll keep it black and white because it seems apt right now. By the way, your shoes are amazingly fresh and clean. I don't know how you keep them like that in New York. Holler at a player if you see him in that street. If you were going to talk to, for instance, you know, a group of white people, and you were going to say, here's what I want you to understand about the black struggle, because you can't know it. That's almost more frustrating is when someone who can never know your struggle, you know, tries to act like they can. I know in my life, there's no way I can know what you've been through, but I can sit here and have you tell me what it's been like, so at least my worldview, at worst, all I do is get smarter. At best, my life changes.
Yeah,
but
and it's
what can we help people understand? Like, for instance, some of our churches, we say we're diverse, and we are, but sometimes, you know, it's not as diverse as we want it to be. And what's it like? Help us understand as we kind of navigate these murky waters. What can we know about the struggle that other minority groups have gone through if we've never, ever walked a day in that life?
Okay, it says 4 questions. All right.
Well, we go back a long way, so I'm getting our, you know, our time's worth here, sir. We didn't bring you out here to talk about. Go ahead.
First of all, church is contextual. All ministry is contextual. Ministry is based upon the context that you're in. If you're pastoring a church in the cornfields of Botkins, Ohio, that is predominantly white, okay, you can pray for diversity all you want. Are you going to bust some black folks in? Are you going to bust some Latinos in so that you can have diversity?
Well said.
No, ministry is contextual. If your context is an all-white community or predominantly white community, why should you feel guilty because you don't have more people of color? Right. If they don't live there, they don't live there.
You should only be clapping if you live in that city, by the way.
So we have to be careful with that. All ministry is contextual. It depends on the context that you're in. And you have to minister according to that context. Now, understand that America suffers from historical amnesia. And once we...
So you don't want to make America great again? I'm kidding. Let's not go there. Like, what era are we talking? Okay.
So when you have a white person say to a person of color, yeah, you know, I don't agree with the past and the things that happened in the past. And, you know, my great-great-grandfather may have been racist, but I'm not. I don't believe in oppression and slavery and whatnot. You know, so I'm removed from all that. So can we have a relationship on that basis? Well, your assumptions are wrong. You're not removed because although you may not be the perpetrator of those injustices, you are indeed a beneficiary of those injustices. So that gives you an advantage 300 years later that I don't have 300 years later. And we know that the playing field of human experience is not level. That's why we appeal to God. That's why, you know, the prophecy said that when Messiah comes, he would fill every valley. He would lower every hill and mountain. He would make the crooked straight. He would take the rough roads and make them smooth. And this is beautiful metaphor for, number one, he would fill the valleys. In Luke, if I may, chapter 3, it opens with the power structure at the time when John and Jesus began their ministry. And why does it present the power structure? Because the message would actually speak out against the status quo and the power elite. So that phrase out of the book of Isaiah, when it speaks of the valley being filled, it's talking about the vacuum for righteous leadership would now be made available and filled before the people. Messiah would bring that. When it spoke of mountains and hills being lowered, it doesn't mean that he's going to go around the world and take Mount Everest and crush it to the planet. No, it's metaphor for the fact that those who are proud and arrogant in positions of power will be humbled and are given an empathy and sensitivity to the realities of human experience, especially the disenfranchised and the marginalized. It speaks of the crooked being made straight, that he would address corruption. The rough roads being made smooth is that based upon the struggle for power and greed and corruption, those things that lead to the abundant life, all right, there are obstacles and difficulties in the way that will be removed at the coming of Messiah. And that's why right after that text, John then speaks to the crowds and he says, who's warned you to flee, you brood of vipers? And then they started to ask him. The tax collectors responded. The soldiers asked him, what do we do? And he began to speak to their corruption. He began to speak to their injustices. See, that's where we need to be and have a very deep and profound and honest conversation and not be afraid. Issue of race as Christians has to be dealt with up front, and it's not in this conversation, it's in your theology. We have two heritages in life. We have an earthly, natural heritage that traces us back to some color, to some community, to some cultures, to some geographic location. But our spiritual heritage, which is greater than our natural heritage, traces us back to God. And we discover the Imago Dei and we're elevated to a level that transcends all of the issues and walls and barriers down here. Because I, in the image of God, I can transcend all of these things that try to suppress me, marginalize me, and disenfranchise me. Because I have a whole new image of myself. And that's why if any man be in Christ, he's a new creature, a new identity, a new image, a new self-concept, a new self-esteem.
Can we go ahead and pound that out?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Do you think the issue of white privilege is real?
Absolutely.
Go ahead and say it one more time.
Absolutely.
Okay. And if
like
this,
I said.
I'm just saying, before you can go there, if this kind of thing bothers you, you're exactly the type of person that needs to be involved in the conversation. Because by being bothered, I think that's the first step to at least acknowledging that there's an issue. And I don't think the point of any of these conversations is necessarily to convince anyone. But even this statement right now, whether we agree or disagree, the conversation is the conduit for change. And so I appreciate you speaking truthfully. I just want to say if this makes you uncomfortable, because I know some people, you might not be doing physically, but spiritually you might be shifting in your seat. It needs to be heard. So back to what we just asked. You believe white privilege is real?
Absolutely. Any power elite or beneficiaries of the power elite becomes a privileged class within a society. I love when Jesus spoke with the woman at the well. She was a Samaritan. She was a result of over 800 years of war because she was a product of when the Assyrians came in and took the northern kingdoms of Israel. They intermarried, and they created this Samaritan culture, which tried to mirror theologically and spiritually the Jewish culture. But they were considered hybrids. They were considered half-breeds. So they were looked down upon and were disenfranchised and marginalized within the society. So now he has this conversation with her, and he goes beyond just the conversation, because if you notice in the text, he says, give me something to drink. And she says, there's nothing to draw from. And he said, well, draw it and give it to me. So what he was saying is, I'm willing to drink from your cup. That's deep, because it's not until you're able to drink from my cup my experiences, my path, my journey, that you can really identify with me and then speak into my life.
You know, it was cool because you didn't want to know what we were going to talk about, which shows the depth of your security in what you believe, which I love. And I think, let me just run this by you. How can you know if your theology is racist? Because you said that before, and I think some people were like, is that even possible? You know, I think we forget sometimes how deeply we're ingrained in our own culture, that sometimes if you pick your head up and you think, wow, I've never thought of that. Maybe even the way I view the Bible. So if you had like a quick checklist, you know that old guy, I think Jeff Foxworthy, he was like, you know you're a redneck if.
Yeah. You know if you're racist is.
You know your theology is racist when.
Well,
no, go there. Do it. Say it.
Let's make the distinction between racist and racism.
Okay.
Racist is a person who has a feeling of superiority above other people by virtue of that person's race. Okay? Racism is the intentional violence, oppression, marginalization, disenfranchisement against a segment of the society based on race. So if your theology gives you a sense of superiority over other people, then that theology is racist. If you take it to the next step of engaging in acts of violence, whether overt or covert, or marginalization, or the support of disenfranchisement and marginalization of a particular people because of their race, then now you've gone from being racist to engaging in racism.
Do you feel like, you know, a lot of people say, for whatever reason, even the past couple months, there was a stat that I read about how many churches didn't even address it.
How many churches?
I don't know the stat. I believe 90% of all stats are wrong anyway. So, but I know for a fact, I know people who pastor churches, and I love them dearly, but I know they didn't touch it. You know, when these two men recently, the stuff that sparked the latest round of controversy, these two men were killed, they didn't touch it. I think, how do you as a pastor, because people will say, church should stay away from that, which is, to me, insane. But people will say, you know, you need to just be a pastor. You need to stay out of politics. And your church needs to, you know, I don't think we can separate them. And you have always been in our city, I think one of the first places a politician will go or an activist will go to try to get you and CCC behind them in whatever they're doing. Because if you're behind them, you know, there's weight to it. How have you navigated this? Because first of all, do you believe that the church should continue to have a hand in politics? Do we need to concern ourselves with this stuff? Or is it something where we have to keep a distance and, you know, and remain almost neutral?
You know, we can be hypocritical as Christians. Black,
really?
white, it doesn't matter. All right? So if a black person goes to a church of color in Brooklyn, Manhattan, doesn't matter, and their theology says, well, I don't want anything to do with politics. I don't want to associate with people like Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson and these, Black Lives Matters, etc. Got it? Because Jesus said, come out from among them, be ye separate, saith the Lord, touch not the unclean thing. But then your 18-year-old son gets pulled over by the police, is harassed, gets into an altercation, is shot and killed. Now you get on the phone and say, can I speak to Al Sharpton? All of a sudden, all of that talk goes out the window because the realities of human experience has now come home. But it shouldn't take something like that for you to understand that you are connected no matter what. Politics is power. Who's got it? How they're using it? How did they get it? Should they keep it? Politics is who gets what, when, and how. So when we think of politics, we're thinking of quality of life. So if you think that politics doesn't matter, then you've got to think about what's going to impact the quality of the education that your children receive in their community, the quality of sanitation removal that you experience in your community, the condition of the roads, the delivery of services such as postal services, et cetera, all right? Because whoever's in power, all right, they're making decisions that directly impact your quality of life. That's a reality. You know, I'll say this. I don't know how much time we have, but I took a group of pastors and leaders at a conference that I was doing in Atlanta. There were 200, and I separated the room half and half. One group, 100, another 100 here. And I said, okay, you guys, I want you to read, right now, read the book of Philippians. And I want you guys to read the book of Colossians. And I sat and I waited for them to finish. And I said, now I want you to mark down, you Philippian people, you are now Philippian people over here. I want you to mark down all the references to Jesus that you read in that book. And I want all you Colossians people to read, to mark down all of the references to Jesus that you read in that book. And let's talk about it. The Philippian side, he took the form of a servant. He humbled himself. It spoke of individual relationship with Christ and the strengthening of the unity of the brethren, that he put aside power, submitted himself to power, and took on the form of a servant. That's those Philippian peoples over there. Bless your sweetheart. The Colossian people, their Jesus, he was the cosmic ruler of the universe. He was the head of the church. All principalities and powers were submitted to him. He was the divine guide and author of all things. By him, all things consist. Every power, visible, invisible, everything human or spiritual was under his authority. So they have a localized Jesus, humble, setting power aside, and they have